The blizzard tore through Frost Hollow Station like something starving. Snow didn't fall, it attacked, horizontal and vicious, turning the air white and the ground into glass. The platform stood empty except for one man, hunched against the wind, his coat too thin for survival. Jonas Callahan didn't move when the train whistle screamed through the storm. He wasn't waiting to board. He had nowhere to go. His hands gripped a leather satchel, knuckles bone-white from cold and something deeper. Inside that bag lay a stack of letters, rejections, every one of them. Ranch jobs he'd begged for. Labor positions he'd promised to excel at. All answered the same way, no. Tucked beneath those failures sat a piece of paper that mattered more than all the rest combined, a child's drawing, crude and precious, showing 3 stick figures holding hands. A family that no longer existed. Red's breath came in shallow clouds. The threadbare coat across his shoulders might as well have been paper. 44 years old, and the cold reached straight through to his bones like it owned him. Once, Jonas Red Callahan had been someone. A ranch foreman men respected. A husband who came home to warmth and laughter. A father who lifted his boy onto his shoulders and promised him the world would be kind. That world had lied. The fever took Lillian first. Red could still see her face, pale against the pillow, her hand going slack in his. He'd spent everything trying to save her, sold their home, borrowed against his future, begged doctors from 3 counties over. None of it mattered. She died anyway, and the debt buried him alive. The ranch let him go. Couldn't keep a foreman who couldn't focus, they said. Couldn't pay a man drowning in his own mistakes. Then winter came early, brutal and unforgiving, and Red looked at his son, 8 years old, shivering in a hut with holes in the roof, and knew the truth. Ethan wouldn't survive the season. Not with him. Not like this. So Red walked his boy to the pastor's door and handed him over. Ethan didn't cry. That was the worst part. The boy just looked up at him with trust still shining in his eyes, like his father wasn't abandoning him. Like this was temporary. Red told himself it was. He told himself he'd come back when spring arrived, when he found work, when he became someone worthy of being called a father again. But spring felt like a story someone else got to live. Now he stood on this frozen platform, waiting for nothing, because waiting was all he had left. The prospector's hut he slept in leaked wind through every crack. The odd jobs he scraped together barely bought bread. And every door he knocked on closed in his face. The train whistle blew again, closer now, cutting through his thoughts like a blade. Through the curtain of white, something moved. A figure emerged from the storm, stumbling, unsteady, wrapped in fabric far too fine for this wilderness. A woman, her dress expensive but useless against the cold, her face pale as death beneath a frost-covered hood. She collapsed against a post, trembling so violently her teeth clattered together. Red's body moved before his mind caught up. He crossed the platform in 3 strides, his own cold forgotten. Up close, he could see she wasn't much older than 35, her gloved hands clutching the post like it was the only thing keeping her upright. She looked up at him, eyes glazed and distant, lips blue. Red didn't think. Didn't calculate. Didn't consider that he'd die without his coat in this storm. He just peeled it from his shoulders and draped it over hers. The cold hit Red's body like a fist. Without the coat, the wind became teeth, biting through his shirt, turning his skin to ice. His hands shook as he stepped back, but he didn't reach for the fabric again. The woman stared at him, eyes widening as comprehension broke through her delirium. She tried to speak, but her jaw wouldn't cooperate. Her fingers clutched the coat tighter, pulling it close, and something flickered across her face, shock, confusion, something that looked like pain. Red nodded once, then turned away. What else was there to say? The train was coming. She'd be safe soon. That was enough. But her hand shot out, catching his sleeve. Her grip was weak, trembling, but insistent. She fumbled inside her dress with the other hand, retrieving a small card. Pressed it into his palm. Then released him and stumbled toward the train as it shrieked into the station, brakes screaming against frozen rails. Red watched her climb aboard, watched a porter reach down to help her, watched the door slam shut behind expensive fabric and privilege. Steam billowed. Metal groaned. The train pulled away, swallowed by the storm within seconds. He stood there, alone again, the wind carving into his chest like it wanted to hollow him out completely. His fingers opened. The card was cream-colored, embossed with elegant lettering he could barely read in the dark. He shoved it into his pocket and turned back toward the hut that waited for him, cold, empty, and permanent as a grave. The walk took 20 minutes. By the time Red pushed through the door, his entire body had gone numb. He collapsed onto the pile of blankets that served as a bed, pulled them over himself, and waited for warmth that wouldn't come. Sleep found him eventually, thin and restless. Miles away, inside a private train compartment lined with polished wood and velvet cushions, Charlotte Prescott finally stopped shaking. The heat from the coal stove wrapped around her like mercy. She'd stripped off her ruined gloves, her frost-damaged cloak, everything that reminded her of how close she'd come to dying on that platform. But she kept the stranger's coat draped across her lap, fingers tracing the worn fabric. It smelled like wood smoke and hard work. Like someone who'd spent years outdoors, earning every mile. The elbows were patched. The seams had been repaired by unpracticed hands. This wasn't a coat someone gave away lightly. This was survival, handed over without hesitation to a woman he'd never seen before. Lottie's throat tightened. Her hand slipped into the pocket, habit, nothing more, and pulled out a folded piece of paper. She opened it carefully, smoothing the creases. A child's drawing stared back at her. 3 figures rendered in clumsy lines, a tall man, a woman with yellow hair, and a small boy between them. They held hands. Above them, a sun with rays like spikes. Below, grass drawn in green strokes. In the corner, written in careful letters, "Our Family." By Ethan. Lottie's breath caught. The stranger hadn't just given her his coat. He'd given her everything. This wasn't an extra layer. This was the only thing standing between him and death, and inside it, he carried the last remnant of a family that no longer existed. She pressed the drawing to her chest, eyes closing. The memory rose unbidden, sharp as broken glass. She'd been 7 years old, abandoned outside a church in Montana Territory during a winter that killed dozens. Her mother had left her there with promises of return that never came. Lottie had waited, freezing, too scared to knock, too young to understand she was dying. Then an old trapper stumbled past, saw her huddled there, and without a word removed his bearskin coat and laid it over her small body. "Stay warm, little one," he'd whispered, then disappeared into the night. That coat saved her life. The church found her the next morning, still breathing, still alive because a stranger had chosen her survival over his own comfort. Lottie never saw the trapper again. Never learned his name. But she carried that moment like a lantern through every dark year that followed, through the orphanage, through the years of scrubbing floors and mending clothes, through the day a railroad surveyor noticed her sharp mind and offered her work as a clerk. She'd climbed from there. Learned the business from the ground up. Invested every penny. Made allies in boardrooms where women weren't supposed to exist. By 30, she'd quietly acquired controlling interest in the Northern Continental Railroad, though few knew her name. By 35, she'd become one of the most powerful figures in Western expansion, invisible, deliberate, and untouchable. But somewhere along the way, she'd forgotten what that trapper's coat had meant. She'd forgotten kindness wasn't strategy. That compassion didn't calculate return. That some people still gave without weighing the cost. Until tonight. Until a broken man on a frozen platform handed her everything he had left. Lottie opened her eyes and stared at the drawing again. At the careful way the child had spelled his name. At the hope embedded in every crooked line. This wasn't business. This was something far more sacred. She rose and pulled the velvet cord that summoned her assistant. Within minutes, Bartholomew Lyle appeared in the doorway, a compact, efficient man in his 50s who'd served as her right hand for a decade. "Bart," she said quietly, holding up the drawing. "I need you to find someone." He stepped closer, studying the paper. His expression didn't change, but his posture shifted, alert, focused. "The man from the station. His name is on this card." She retrieved it from the coat pocket and handed it over. "Jonas Callahan. Red, they likely call him. He gave me his coat in a blizzard. He has a son named Ethan. And I need to know everything, where he lives, why he was on that platform, what brought him to that moment." Bart nodded once, tucking both items carefully into his jacket. "How quickly?" "As fast as you can without breaking him further." Lottie's voice softened. "He's already broken, Bart. I saw it in his eyes. I need to understand why. And when I find him, bring him to me. Gently. No force. No intimidation." She paused, choosing her words with the same precision she used in negotiations. "Tell him someone wants to thank him properly." Bart studied her face for a long moment. He'd worked for her long enough to recognize when something mattered beyond profit margins and expansion schedules. "This is personal." "Yes." He didn't ask why. That wasn't his way. He simply bowed his head and left, already planning routes and inquiries, already shifting into the methodical investigation that made him invaluable. Lottie returned to the window, watching darkness and snow blur together beyond the glass. The train rocked gently beneath her, carrying her toward meetings and contracts and a dozen decisions that would shape the future of the West. But her mind stayed on that platform. On a man who'd chosen her life over his own without hesitation, without knowing who she was or what she could offer in return. She thought of the trapper's coat, heavy and warm around her 7-year-old shoulders. She thought of how that single act of mercy had carried her through 30 years of survival and ambition. And she thought of the child's drawing, tucked safely in her assistant's pocket now, being carried back toward the man who'd kept it close to his heart even when he had nothing else left. Red had given her more than warmth. He'd reminded her why any of this mattered at all. 3 days passed like years. Red swung the axe again, feeling the impact shudder through his arms. The lumber camp paid poorly, but it paid, enough for stale bread and watered-down coffee. Enough to keep his body moving through another day of cold that never quite left his bones. The other men didn't talk to him much. He preferred it that way. Conversations led to questions, and questions led to explanations he didn't have the strength to give. So he worked in silence, splitting logs until his shoulders screamed, then collapsed each night onto a shared bunk in a cabin that smelled like sweat and tobacco. He didn't think about the woman from the station. Tried not to, anyway. But some nights, when exhaustion finally dragged him under, he dreamed of her pale face in the storm, of the weight of his coat leaving his shoulders, of the card she'd pressed into his palm. He'd looked at it once, back in his hut, before the lumber camp foreman had recruited him for the week. The lettering meant nothing to him, just a name he couldn't quite make out in the dim light, and an address in some city he'd never see. He'd left the card behind when he'd packed his satchel. Left it with everything else that reminded him of hope. The axe came down again. Wood split clean. Callahan. Red straightened, wiping sweat from his forehead despite the cold. The foreman stood at the edge of the clearing, but he wasn't alone. A compact man in a fine coat stood beside him, looking entirely out of place among the stumps and sawdust. "Got someone here asking for you," the foreman called, then spat into the snow and walked away. Red's grip tightened on the axe handle. Debt collectors didn't usually dress that well, but desperation made men creative. He considered running. Considered a dozen excuses. Then decided he was too tired for any of it. He crossed the clearing slowly, axe still in hand, not threatening, just unwilling to be completely defenseless. The stranger studied him with calm, assessing eyes. Jonas Callahan. Depends who's asking. My name is Bartholomew Lyle. I work for someone you met 3 nights ago at Frost Hollow Station. The man reached into his coat and pulled out a familiar piece of paper, Ethan's drawing, carefully preserved. She'd like to speak with you. Red's chest constricted. He stared at the drawing, at his son's careful letters, at the family that only existed now in crayon and memory. I don't want charity. She didn't mention charity. Bart's tone remained neutral, professional. She mentioned gratitude. And an opportunity to thank you properly. I don't need thanks. Perhaps not. Bart folded the drawing and returned it to his pocket. But she traveled a considerable distance to offer it. The Frost Hollow Hotel. Tomorrow at noon. She'll wait 1 hour, Mr. Callahan. After that, she won't disturb you again. Red wanted to refuse. Wanted to tell this well-dressed stranger to take his mysterious employer and her gratitude and leave him to the only life he deserved, hard, cold, and anonymous. But the drawing haunted him. The fact that she'd kept it. The fact that she'd sent someone to find him in the middle of nowhere, just to return a piece of paper his son had drawn months ago. Why? The word came out rougher than he intended. Bart tilted his head slightly, something almost like respect flickering across his features. Because 3 nights ago, you gave her everything you had. She'd like to understand the man who would do such a thing. The silence stretched between them, filled only by the distant sound of axes biting into wood and men shouting instructions across the camp. Finally, Red nodded once. Noon. Thank you, Mr. Callahan. Bart turned to leave, then paused. She asked me to tell you something else. She said you reminded her that compassion still exists in this world. She wanted you to know that mattered. Red stood outside the Frost Hollow Hotel the next day, staring at doors he had no business walking through. He'd borrowed a cleaner's shirt from one of the men at the lumber camp. Scrubbed his face and hands until they were raw. Combed his hair back with water that froze in the wind before he reached the hotel steps. None of it made him look less like what he was, a man who belonged in work camps and collapsing huts, not carpeted lobbies with chandeliers. The clock tower across the square read 5 minutes past noon. He'd already walked away twice. Circled the block like a coward, telling himself this was foolish, that gratitude from wealthy strangers meant nothing, that he should return to the lumber camp and forget any of this had happened. But the drawing kept him rooted. The fact that she'd kept it safe. The fact that someone had cared enough to find him. Red pushed through the doors. Warmth hit him immediately, not just heat from the fireplaces, but the warmth of polished wood and clean air, of a world where cold didn't reach through walls and steal your breath at night. A clerk behind the desk looked up, started to speak, then hesitated at Red's appearance. Before the man could decide whether to call for help or offer assistance, Bart appeared from a side corridor. Mr. Callahan. He nodded toward a staircase. This way, please. Red followed, boots loud against floors that shouldn't have to suffer them. They climbed to the 2nd floor, moved down a hallway lined with paintings of mountain landscapes and frontier settlements, stopped at a door marked with a brass number. Bart knocked twice, then opened it without waiting for response. The room beyond was simple despite the hotel's grandeur, a sitting area with 2 chairs near a window, a small table between them, and nothing excessive. Functional. Almost plain. The woman from the station stood near the window, hands folded, watching the street below. She turned as they entered, and Red saw her clearly for the first time without storm and darkness obscuring her features. Younger than he'd assumed, mid-30s, with dark hair pulled back simply and eyes that held something he couldn't quite name. Intelligence, certainly. But also something raw. Something that recognized pain because it had lived there. Mr. Callahan. Her voice was gentle, steady. Thank you for coming. Red removed his hat, gripping it between both hands. Ma'am. She gestured to one of the chairs. Please, sit. He didn't move. I appreciate the thanks, but you didn't need to go to this trouble. I did what anyone would have done. No. The word came quietly but firm. You did what almost no one would have done. You gave away your survival to a stranger. She crossed to the table and lifted something from it, his coat, cleaned and repaired, the patches reinforced, the tears mended with careful stitching. I wanted to return this properly. Red stared at the coat. His throat closed. Please, she said again, holding it out. Sit. Give me a few minutes. He took the coat with shaking hands, felt the weight of it, heavier now, warmer, transformed by someone's care into something better than it had been. He lowered himself into the chair because his legs wouldn't hold him anymore. She sat across from him, studying his face with an intensity that should have made him uncomfortable but somehow didn't. It wasn't judgment in her gaze. It was recognition. My name is Charlotte Prescott, she began. Though most call me Lottie. And I need you to understand something before we continue. She paused, choosing words with visible care. 3 nights ago, you saved my life. But you also reminded me of something I'd forgotten, something I needed desperately to remember. Red shook his head. I just gave you a coat. You gave me everything you had. Lottie leaned forward slightly, her voice carrying weight that pressed against the space between them. That coat was your only protection against a storm that could have killed you. And inside it, you carried a drawing of your family, something precious beyond measure. You handed all of that to a stranger without hesitation. Red's fingers tightened on the coat in his lap. You were freezing. So were you. She didn't look away. Mr. Callahan, do you know what I do? Who I am? He shook his head. I own the Northern Continental Railroad. Controlling interest. I've spent 15 years building an empire that spans half the Western Territories. I employ thousands. I move millions in capital every month. I shape the future of this frontier with every decision I make. She paused. And somewhere in all of that, I forgot why any of it mattered. Red didn't know what to say to that. He sat silent, coat heavy across his knees, while she continued. When I was 7 years old, I was abandoned outside a church in Montana Territory during winter. I was dying, actually dying, when an old trapper found me and gave me his coat. He saved my life, Mr. Callahan. That single act of compassion carried me through 30 years of survival. It's why I'm sitting here now. It's why I built everything I built. Her eyes glistened, though no tears fell. But I'd forgotten what that felt like. To be on the receiving end of selfless kindness. To witness integrity that doesn't calculate cost. She reached into her dress and withdrew Ethan's drawing, unfolding it gently on the table between them. Until you reminded me. Red stared at his son's careful lines, at the family that existed now only in crayon. His voice came out rough. That's my boy's drawing. I know. Ethan. Lottie's expression softened. Bart told me about him. About your wife. About everything you lost. She leaned back, giving him space. I asked you here because I want to offer you something. Not charity, I understand that would insult what you did. But opportunity. Recognition of something rare. I'm nobody. The words tasted like ash. I'm a failed foreman who couldn't save his wife, couldn't keep his job, couldn't even provide shelter for his own son. I'm exactly what I look like, washed up and worthless. No. The steel in her voice cut through his self-loathing. You're a man who gave away his last defense against death to save a stranger. You're a man who carries his child's drawing even when he has nothing else. You're a man whose first instinct, even in your own desperation, was compassion. She stood, moving to the window again. Mr. Callahan, I'm offering you a position. A job I'm creating specifically for you. Red almost laughed. What job could you possibly create for someone like me? Frontier Liaison Officer. She turned back to face him. My railroad cuts through communities, Mr. Callahan. It changes lives, sometimes for the better, often for the worse. I need someone who understands what it means to lose everything. Someone who sees people, not profit. Someone whose integrity can't be bought because it's already been tested by fire and survived. She crossed back to the table, standing before him now. Good salary. Housing. A purpose that matters. And a position that would allow you to reunite with your son. The room fell silent except for the crackling of logs in the fireplace and the distant sounds of the street below. Red looked up at her, this railroad magnate who tracked him down just to return a coat and a child's drawing. Why? Why does any of this matter to you? Lottie held his gaze without flinching. Because that trapper who saved me died in the cold that same night. I learned that years later, found records, traced the story. He gave me his coat knowing he wouldn't survive without it. He chose my life over his own, and I never got to thank him. Never got to tell him what his sacrifice meant. What it became. Her voice softened. I won't make that mistake twice. You're still here, Mr. Callahan. You're still breathing. And I refuse to let the world continue breaking a man whose first instinct is to save others. Red shook his head, the words caught somewhere between his chest and throat. This is pity. This is recognition. She moved closer, crouching slightly so their eyes were level. I spent 15 years clawing my way from nothing to everything. I know what rock bottom looks like. I know what it means to be judged by your circumstances instead of your character. And I know, that integrity like yours doesn't grow from privilege. It grows from having every reason to be cruel and choosing kindness anyway. She straightened, stepping back. I'm not asking you to decide right now. I'm asking you to give me 1 hour, just 1 hour, to prove I'm not offering charity. To show you what I see when I look at you. Red's hands trembled on the coat. Every instinct screamed that this was impossible, that women like her didn't offer men like him anything but rejection. That he'd wake up tomorrow in the lumber camp and realize this had been fever dream born from exhaustion and cold. But the drawing lay on the table between them. Real. Undeniable. And the coat in his hands had been mended with care that spoke of something beyond transaction. 1 hour, he heard himself say. Relief flickered across her face, genuine, unguarded. She nodded and moved to the door, opening it. Bart waited in the hallway, as if he'd known this moment would come. We'll need the carriage, Lottie said quietly. 15 minutes later, Red sat beside her in a covered carriage that rolled smoothly through streets he'd walked countless times as a beggar. She didn't speak during the ride, and he was grateful for the silence. It gave him time to steady his breathing, to convince himself this was real. They stopped before a building on the edge of town, new construction, 2 stories, painted cheerful yellow with white trim. Smoke rose from multiple chimneys. Through the windows, Red could see lamplight and movement. Lottie descended first, then waited while he followed. This is the Lantern House, she said, leading him toward the entrance. I funded it 6 months ago. Very few people know I'm involved. She opened the door. Warmth and noise spilled out, children's laughter, the sound of footsteps on wooden floors, voices calling to one another with joy instead of fear. Red stepped inside and stopped. The main room stretched before him, filled with light from windows and lamps, warmed by a massive stone fireplace. Children of various ages sat in clusters, some reading, some playing with carved toys, some painting on sheets of paper spread across a long table. The walls displayed murals of mountains and forests, horses and streams, all rendered in bright colors that spoke of hope instead of survival. A woman in her 50s looked up from where she supervised the painting table, smiled at Lottie, then returned her attention to a small girl struggling with her brush. These are children who had nowhere else to go, Lottie said quietly beside him. Orphans. Abandoned. Children whose parents died or couldn't feed them. This house gives them shelter, education, warmth. Everything they need to survive and thrive. She moved further into the room, and Red followed, his boots somehow too loud on floors where children played without fear. A boy near the fireplace looked up, maybe 9 years old, with dark hair and a gap-toothed smile. He waved at Lottie like she was someone familiar, someone safe, then returned to the wooden horse he was carving with intense concentration. Red's chest tightened. The boy was Ethan's age. Moved like him. Had that same focused determination when working on something that mattered. "I built this because of that trapper's coat," Lottie said, her voice low enough that only Red could hear. "Because one act of compassion saved my life and gave me the chance to become someone who could save others. This is what that moment became. 30 years later, this is the legacy of kindness." She turned to face him fully. "Your coat, Mr. Callahan. The one you gave me 3 nights ago. Do you understand what it could become? Not today, not tomorrow, but years from now, what might grow from that single moment of sacrifice?" Red looked around the room, at children who were warm and fed and safe, at walls decorated with hope, at a future being built one small life at a time. His vision blurred. "This is my real legacy," Lottie continued. "Not railroads or profit margins. This. Compassion made tangible. And I need someone who understands that. Someone whose heart still chooses mercy even when the world has given him every reason to choose bitterness." She gestured toward the children. "The position I'm offering you, it's not administrative work in some office. It's this. Going into communities where my railroad expands and making sure we don't crush the people we're supposed to be serving. Finding the families who need help. Creating more places like this. Being the human heart of an empire that forgets too easily what human means." Red's voice came out broken. "I couldn't even save my own son. You saved him by giving him to someone who could keep him alive through winter." Lottie's words carried no judgment, only understanding. "That wasn't failure, Mr. Callahan. That was love making the hardest choice a father can make. And now I'm offering you the chance to bring him home, not to a collapsing hut where he'll freeze, but to a real home with warmth and stability and a future." She reached into her coat and withdrew an envelope. "The salary I'm offering would cover housing, food, education for Ethan, everything you need to be his father again. Not someday. Now." Red took the envelope with shaking hands, opened it, and stared at figures that represented more money than he'd seen in 5 years. His breath caught. "This isn't charity," Lottie said again, softer now. "This is an investment in a kind of person this frontier desperately needs. Someone who hasn't forgotten how to see suffering and respond with compassion. Someone who gave everything to a stranger because it was the right thing to do." The small girl at the painting table laughed, pure and unself-conscious, and the sound cut through every defense Red had left. He thought of Ethan's drawing. Of his son's careful letters spelling out our family. Of the promise he'd made to come back when he became worthy again. He thought of Lillian, who'd loved him not because he was perfect but because his heart knew how to choose kindness even when life was cruel. And he thought of the coat he'd given away in a blizzard, not because he expected anything in return, but because a woman was freezing and he couldn't walk away from that. Red looked at Lottie, this woman who'd built an empire and remembered mercy, who tracked him down to prove his life still mattered, who saw worth in a broken man standing in a room full of rescued children. "One question," he said, voice rough with emotion. "When can I start?" Lottie smiled, not triumphant, but grateful. Like he'd given her something precious. "Tomorrow, Mr. Callahan. Tomorrow you ride with Bart to bring your son home. And the day after, we begin building the kind of West where compassion shapes the future." Red nodded, unable to speak, the envelope clutched in his hands like a lifeline. Outside, snow had begun to fall again, soft this time, gentle. Through the window, Red could see the platform at Frost Hollow Station in the distance, barely visible through white. The place where he'd stood hopeless and freezing just days ago. The place where everything had changed. He turned back to the room, to the children and the warmth and the life Lottie had built from one stranger's kindness. And for the first time in years, Jonas, Red, Callahan felt something he'd thought was lost forever. He felt like he deserved a future. Red's story reminds us that one act of kindness can change everything, not just for the person who receives it, but for the one who gives it too. Sometimes the bravest thing we can do is choose compassion when the world has given us every reason not to. If this story touched your heart, show some love by hitting that like button. It helps us share more stories like Red's with people who need to hear them. And if you're new here, subscribe so you never miss another tale from the frontier, where broken souls find redemption and kindness becomes legacy. Drop a comment and tell us, have you ever witnessed or experienced an unexpected act of compassion that changed your perspective? We'd love to hear your story. Until next time, remember, sometimes the smallest gestures carry the greatest weight. Thanks for listening, and we'll see you in the next story.